One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is September 5th, 2012, the Wednesday night edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, of course. And tonight I have a jam-packed show. I have a guest who's going to be joining me for 2 hours to go over a slew of things. My guest is a regular to the broadcast. You've all heard him here before. I would say he's probably one of the most controversial people in the quote-unquote 9/11 truth movement. And I say that because wherever he goes, sometimes I guess his ideas on things or the evidence that he brings forward and things that he talks about make people uncomfortable. But you know what? That's the whole point of good debate, is to make people uncomfortable and actually sit and have an intelligent conversation to go over things. So I want to welcome him back to the broadcast. My good friend, Professor Jim Fetzer. Welcome back, Jim.
Hey, Popeye, it's great to be here. I think that's the price you pay for being at the cutting edge.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, I don't think that if people disagree with different ideas about different things, there's this like instantaneous reaction to jump on people and attack them like with emotion, and it's just, we need to stop and just sit back. Even if we don't agree on something, you can still have a educated, well-informed debate about it. You know what I mean? And you know what, Jim? You and I don't agree on everything. Does that mean that you and I hate each other and I can't talk to you? You know what I mean?
Oh, I know, Popeye. And I set up this Vancouver hearing, which was held 15 to 17 June, in order to deal with the controversial issues that divide us. And we did a pretty good job, actually. I think if there are four major areas that we were addressing, one being what did or didn't happen at the Pentagon, a second, how the Twin Towers were destroyed, a third, the evidence of fabrication of all four of the crash sites, and fifth, who was responsible and why. I think we did a pretty good job of covering those bases, and that there's really not a lot of room for debate about it, given what we have discovered. So we can elaborate on that later in the show if you like.
Yeah, we can get into that. There's a few other things I want to get your opinion on, though, because see, a lot of people always think that you only know about 9/11, or maybe you know about the JFK assassination, but you constantly, your brain is constantly functioning, Jim. You're not just a one or two trick pony, and you do have thoughts about many other things, including, by the way, the assassination of Paul Wellstone, which I find interesting that movie that was put out on YouTube that you actually pointed me to. Apparently, the filmmakers are trying to put it together into a documentary to be released on DVD. So that's going to be interesting because that's something that needs to get out there.
Wellstone, they killed him?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they may have succeeded in doing that, if I'm not mistaken. That's Snowshoe Films. They do simply excellent work. And they, I've done a huge amount of research on this. I published 10 columns before anyone else was taking a serious look at the case, co-authored a book on it. Actually, I was on Coast to Coast, Popeye, if you can believe, talking about this after I'd published exactly one column. And the guest host then, an Ian Punnett from St. Paul, was, I think, trying to undercut what I was suggesting about Wellstone, but I already knew the case well enough that he was unsuccessful. And now I brought a fellow named John Costello, who's a PhD with a specialty in electromagnetism. I flew him up from Australia. We were tramping around the crash site in the middle of winter in 35 below zero, picking up pieces of charred wreckage from the fuselage. And, I've continued to make presentations and publish about it, where you can find my most recent work not only on the Wellstone crash, but 9/11, JFK, and a host of other issues at Veterans Today. If you just search on Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer. But I really like this Snowshoe Films production because they went over all the witnesses, everything else, all the points I'd been making. They actually did their own independent research and came up with the same conclusion, and featured me and John in their video. It's really an excellent piece of work.
And go ahead and plug your book really quick about Wellstone's murder, because that's a piece of evidence that people need to grab and hold on to. Go ahead and tell them.
Yeah. It's entitled "American Assassination: The Strange Death of Senator Paul Wellstone." It may or may not still be in print. See if you can find a used copy. If you go to Assassination Science or just YouTube, you can find an hour lecture I gave at the University of Minnesota Duluth shortly before I retired, entitled "The Senator Paul Wellstone Assassination." And you can also find, by doing a search, the article I co-authored with John Costello after the book had been published, where the book itself was co-authored with a Native American scholar, then from Northern Arizona University, by the name of Don Four Arrows Jacobs. And John and I published a piece after going through the 2,500 pages of documents and records that the NTSB claimed to have based its report, which is about 79 or 80 pages, upon, and found some startling new stuff that confirmed our earlier research, which is discussed in an article entitled "The NTSB Failed Wellstone, Popeye." It was published by Michael Rupert on his From the Wilderness website, both electronically and hard copy. And it's a relatively short paper, I think probably about 4 pages with 6 or 7 photographs, but it has 115 notes. I think it's probably the most copiously documented short paper ever published.
Well, your book itself, it's not huge. It's not like an encyclopedia thick, but there's so much evidence right from the first page. And it's, in case people, you might find parts of it when he's talking about the NTSB and stuff, it might sound boring, but I urge you to, just like if you read 9/11 Debunking by David Ray Griffin, the stuff in there about the FAA and stuff, it seems dry, but it's important info.
Well, Popeye,
if you have to read it twice, read it twice. The book itself, though, really does flow.
Well, it's actually an exercise in scientific methodology because, that's my area of expertise. And what I did was just to apply the principles of scientific reasoning methodically. So I even give you, a summary of the evidence and how to evaluate the evidence in relation to the alternative hypothesis. So we're really comparing an accident versus an assassination hypothesis. It turns out, Popeye, and this is going to stun your audience, that the NTSB cannot investigate a crash scene as a sabotage or assassination unless it is authorized to do so by the Attorney General. So we have here a virtually foolproof method for eliminating your political opponents. Take them out in a plane crash, then have a complicit or compliant Attorney General decline to declare the scene a crime scene, and it can't be investigated as a crime. In fact, the NTSB did not consider that it might have been done by a small bomb or a gas canister or some kind of high-tech weapon. They only considered the plane, the pilots, and the weather. So, I mean, you actually got a sham investigation, which looks to the American people as though they actually did the job, but they didn't. They never considered the possibility it was sabotage, in spite of a mountain of very bizarre evidence, including that
there's red flags all over that whole case. Like their response time alone, they would have had to have had like precognitive thoughts about the plane crashing. Ladies and gentlemen, we got a break coming up. Don't go anywhere. In a few minutes, I will be back with my guest, Jim Fetzer, and we will be getting deep into politics, what's going on with the RNC, and more. We are back. So, Jim, we were talking about Senator Wellstone, and speaking of senators and politicians and things like that, I want to get your take on a few things other than what I normally have you pound home to the listeners. I want to get your take on what's going on right now with the elections, or I like to call it the selection because it's not really an election. But the I don't want to say what do you want to call it, not bread and circus. That doesn't even cover it. What they're doing. This is like a big, almost like a parlor trick, but with just different multiple levels of smoke and mirrors because they baffle people.
Well, there's quite a difference even between the Republican and the Democratic convention, which, of course, is Republican last week and Democratic going on even as we speak. The Republican convention was pretty much a disaster from beginning to end. I mean, Romney wanted to get his tax issues off of the front page, so he made a selection of Paul Ryan, who actually is a member of the House and an extremist on the House Budget Committee. He's from Janesville, a small town that's only about 20, 30 minutes drive from where I reside near Madison, Wisconsin, Popeye. And, the paper, the Wisconsin State Journal, has been following his statements fairly carefully, even though it's a conservative paper. And they reported, for example, that he had been trashing Obama over the closing of a plant in Janesville. But the plant was actually closed before Obama came to office, so that he was just making this stuff up out of whole cloth. But the problem for them is much greater than that. I mean, Ryan is an extremist about reproductive rights. He believes, as an awful lot of these right-wingers seem to believe, that there should be no exceptions for rape or incest. This business about legitimate rape with this guy Aiken was a complete and total catastrophe. Then they lost the first day of their convention because of this tropical storm that did not turn into a hurricane. And then the final day, they gave Clint Eastwood this role to play. And Popeye, frankly, I'm convinced it was an act. I mean, Eastwood is actually an excellent actor. He's made a lot of movies lately. I think he came up to play, kind of a slightly befuddled old man. But he was making some killing points in relation to the Republican platform. Like, one of his greatest applause lines was when he was theoretically chastising Obama, who was supposed to be sitting in this empty chair, and said, well, you promised to end the war. Why don't you just bring our troops home tomorrow? And got a huge applause from the Republicans, not even realizing their own party is dedicated to the proposition that wars should be never ending. So here they were contradicting their own platform by responding in that way to Clint Eastwood.
That whole thing was a little weird.
Well, it was. I actually got on the local radio here to talk about it and made some of these points, and observed, too, that his hair looked kind of weird. And
he looked disheveled, didn't he? Like, why would you go? You're Clint Eastwood, dude. Why would you go out there with your hair all messed up?
Because it's an act. He was pulling an act, and I think that's what gave him, plausible deniability. He could say all these things. They're actually gutting the Republican platform. Another one was when he said tears came to his eyes when he discovered there were 32 million unemployed. And because he's supposed to be talking to Obama, they're treating it as though that's, a shortcoming of Obama. But actually, the way in which Romney made all of his money with Bain was vulture capitalism, breaking up these companies, firing all the workers, denying them of their pension benefits. I mean, this guy is as bad, as corrupt an example of capitalist as we get, this Mitt Romney guy. And, of course, he's now completely contradicting his past life as governor of Massachusetts, where he actually introduced a very good health care plan that became the model for what the Republicans derisively refer to as Obamacare. And while they claim it's going to, greatly expand the national debt, actually the Congressional Budget Office projects it's going to save trillions of dollars, for the federal government. So it's actually going to reduce costs, and it's going to expand benefits. And I think every American ought to be supportive of it. If we can't have a single payer, national health care system, then this looks like a fairly close facsimile. What should have been going on, of course, was a gradual expansion of Medicare, so everyone has Medicare. That was the idea originally when it was introduced.
I don't trust Obamacare personally, and the reason I don't is because it's too shady. There's a lot of things that they're not telling people about. Ideally, I think it would be, honestly, I agree with you, Jim, when you say like it would be good for Americans to have health care. And when people say, oh, that's a socialist idea, no, I agree that it's time that we evolved and started taking care of our own. Well, yeah. But the problem is, I don't think that this bill, the healthcare bill, addresses it. In fact, from what I've seen, it's just more tyranny. Like going to throw you in jail if you don't want healthcare. I do think that if we stop spending money on bombs and rockets and stuff and killing little kids in foreign countries and innocent people in foreign countries, I think we could spend that money here at home. And yeah, then people could have healthcare. I mean, can you imagine how much money we could have saved if instead of invading all these foreign countries and dropping bombs and everything on them, we just went and used that money to help people pay, clean up the mortgage mess and get some healthcare?
You're completely right, Popeye. And in fact, the use of the term socialism is just a propaganda move. I mean, look, if the government is providing benefits for the people that actually help the people, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, workman compensation, these are the programs that actually work and make a difference in people's lives, then from the point of view of those who would like to dispose of them, they call it socialism. But is the government actually benefiting the people? How often does that happen? Normally, the government is being used as a mechanism to enrich the powerful and make the fat cats even wealthier. It's a good thing when the government does something that actually benefits the people. Now, what we have going on here with the Democratic National Convention is a whole lot of capitalizing on this absurd policy attitude toward rape and reproductive rights. I mean, can you believe that the Republicans even want to end Planned Parenthood? I mean, this is bizarre. When I grew up, Planned Parenthood was one of the institutions most admired by the entire nation because, I mean, look, if you're going to have a family, it's better be planned than unplanned, right? What could be more intelligent than figuring out how many children you want to have and when you have them, There's the old saw you may have heard, Popeye. What do you call couples who use the rhythm method? Answer: parents. Okay. I mean, the fact of the matter is that reproductive rights are essential to the nation's well-being, and women who find themselves in a situation of having an unwanted pregnancy should never be forced to carry a fetus to term. I mean, that's a form of reproductive slavery that is medieval. It's reminiscent of putting people in the Iron Maiden, these steel boxes with all these spikes. I mean, what a disgusting practice.
Like, I agree with the woman's right to choose and everything. I just don't think the use of abortion should be pushed to the young kids as a way of contraception. But I don't have, if it's for a medical reason or if it's rape or something like that, or if it's a situation, I understand most situations. I completely, 99.9% of the situations I completely agree with. You know what I mean? I would say, okay, fine. I just don't think it should be taught to kids as a way of contraception. Instead, kids should be taught responsibly to begin with. But a lot of this has to do with the educational system, too.
That's right.
And they teach sex ed stuff, and then the kids go out and they start banging everybody, and they're pregnant by the time they're 16.
But the irony is, Popeye, that the very people who oppose abortion also oppose sex education, and yet sex education demonstrably reduces abortions because it reduces unwanted pregnancy. So people who want to reduce abortion should be all in favor of sex education.
Jim, I'm going to cut you off right there because we got a break coming up, but we'll pick it up right here with this on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. When we went to break, we were discussing the ever touchy subject of abortion and teenage pregnancy and everything else. Now, from what I know, honestly, because I want to wrap this up and I want to move on to the Ron Paul stuff that you and I were chatting about during the break, Jim. But from what I know, from what I've researched, even anything with the word ed attached to the end of it, and this comes right from Charlotte Iserby, is no good. Sex ed, it actually doesn't really teach the kids about good, and not anymore. Maybe back when it first started it did. But now it's just like drug ed, the DARE stuff. It exposes kids to things that they might not have been exposed to. I think, honestly, in my eyes, the whole sex education thing and the problem with teenage pregnancy, that falls back onto the destruction of the family and the parents not being parents. See, if the parents actually paid attention to what their kid was doing and they raised their kid properly, they didn't plop them in front of the television to grow up, and the parents led by example and weren't themselves doing stupid things, then the kids would have better morals. And it's the difference between the generation of people that grew up in the 40s and the 50s, Jim, and the people that grew up now, that are in, maybe between the ages of 15 and 20 right now. There's a huge difference between the morals and everybody, and that's been done on purpose and stuff. But I don't think that a woman should be. First of all, I don't think any legislator or anybody has any type of authority to tell any woman what to do with her body whatsoever. It is her body, after all. And I'm not, beating the women's rights flag or anything like that. I'm just saying we're all humans. It's natural law. If you understand natural law, then you understand you don't have the right. I don't have the right to even tell you what to do with your body. You know what I mean? I can't tell you, Jim, you should go do this, you should exercise. I could make a comment to you, but I can't put a gun to your head and make you do it.
What could be more anti-democratic and authoritarian than for one group of people to tell another that they have to bear a child to term? I mean, that's absurd. A woman has to make these decisions for herself, given her personal circumstances, her physician's advice, and her situation in life. I mean, I can't believe how any serious American could be anti-choice. Calling it pro-life is very misleading. I mean, this whole business about life isn't the question. It's what's known as personhood. At what stage in development of the zygote embryo fetus does this entity have an entitlement to legal protection and safeguards? It's virtually universally been agreed that at the point of viability, the end of the second trimester, is the appropriate time. It's also the time at which the nerve pain system comes into play. And it's also, of course, a point at which, according to the Supreme Court's, in my opinion, infinitely wise decision in Roe v. Wade, a woman can no longer undertake an abortion unless it's to preserve her own life or health, which I think is right. What that means is that there's a recognition here that the fetus, by virtue of reaching the point of viability, which means that it could survive outside of the intrauterine environment without all kinds of special, complicated equipment to create a pseudo-uterine environment, has the very first rights that a human being is entitled to. Historically, live births have been the occasion on which a child, properly named at that point in time, is entitled to be, treated with certain forms of respect under the law. But just because it's eventually going to grow up and, have the right to drive and drink and serve in the military and get married doesn't mean, of course, that early stage younger children should have those rights, nor does it mean that an evolving fetus at earlier stages before viability has the same rights that apply at viability. So,
well, I think the whole argument of my look at it is this: you would actually we're treating the symptom again and not the problem. And this is what we constantly do in this world today. We're taught to never really look at the causality of things and the issues. We always just treat the symptoms that arise because of it. And that's not the proper way to do it. If the parents actually sat down and took more time with their children, okay, the teen pregnancy rate would drop. If it comes to a case where it's a woman getting raped, and she wants to go have an abortion, I don't think any lawmaker has the right to tell you what to do. Again, that's us looking to an outward source, because that makes some people uncomfortable, or it's against their religious beliefs or whatever, and they don't believe in it. And because they can't get their way in forcing their opinion on somebody else, they're going to look to an outside source to enforce that opinion for them. But they would be the same people flipping out if that law or that force was used against them to put someone else's opinion on them. They wouldn't like it, and they'd be crying foul. See, if we would all just grow up and evolve, a lot of these issues would become moot points. People wouldn't be out there in the streets like they are now, mating like monkeys and having all these, getting pregnant and having to go get an abortion. You wouldn't. The morals would be different.
My understanding, actually, Popeye, is that the rate of abortion has been dropping in the last couple of years, not going up. I think a lot of parents find it embarrassing to talk about the facts of life with their kids. I mean, it's something you need to do. But I think an awful lot of parents are relieved if there's a sex education component to biology class, for example, in the public schools, and
which they should be
junior high or high school. Yeah,
in my opinion, you shouldn't be comfortable. And this is my opinion, just from and this is from the research I've done and what I know what they do. I wouldn't want my kid being taught sex by some teacher in the health class or whatever, and God knows what they're going to teach him. I would want to do it. I would want to do it the way my parents did. They sat me down and they had that talk. And you know what? If you're uncomfortable talking to your kid about it, stop being a pansy. I mean, come on. Let's be real. We're all.
Look. I take a bit more positive attitude toward the public schools and the education system. I mean, most teachers, of biology and so forth can do a perfectly appropriate instruction in sexual intercourse and sperm and ova and conception and reproduction in the 9-month period of gestation. I mean, we're a sexually reproducing species. And it's very important, it seems to me, that young people should be taught the basics. I mean, in an era of AIDS and herpes and God only knows what else is out there, it's important, I think, for our young people to know how to avoid, pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases and all that. There is no correlation, by the way, between having sex education and early onset of intimacy with the opposite sex. It's not the case that students who know more through sex education are therefore earlier in engaging in intercourse. That's just a myth.
Well, I'm not saying that is 100% the case, but anybody, when they're exposed to that type of stuff, what they don't teach them a lot of times is the sex education curriculum is not even written by the teacher that is doing the teaching. It's written, from some national source. So,
well, the thing is,
God knows what they're pumping out. But I agree that I also think, and this is from a personal, my own experience, when I was a kid, when they taught us sex education, Jim, it was in senior year in high school, and by that time, most of the kids already had a 1-year-old, we had...
They already knew what sex was all about.
Yeah, we had girls that had 1- and 2-year-old kids. They actually had a parenting class in my school. They had to institute a parenting course, and what they did was they would actually have the kids that had the girls that had children. They would bring their kid to school with them, and they would teach them how to be a parent.
Were you in a larger urban area?
No. I mean, I was in the suburbs between the mountains and the city. I mean, I was right outside New York City, but this wasn't like...
You're outside New York?
Manhattan.
Outside, whereabouts?
You know where Paterson, New Jersey is?
Yeah.
Okay, right around that area. So
you were actually in Jersey, not in New York.
Yeah, in New Jersey. So right outside New York. So I mean, it was the suburbs.
I think probably sixth grade is the level at which sex education ought to be taught. I mean, as you suggest, later is maybe too late.
Well, see, that's
too early.
I see both sides of the argument. You know what I mean? Like,
the fact of the matter is, issues like sex education, even this business about immigration, pot, flag burning, all this stuff. These are issues that the right wing uses to try to convince a lot of poor whites to vote against their own economic interests. And the problem the Republican Party has, and they're well aware of it, is they represent an increasingly shrinking percentage of the population. So that if there are honest elections, they're going to lose. They're going to lose election after election after election, and there's no turning back. What's going on right now, Popeye, and it actually began in 2000 with Bush in Florida, is they are using electronic voting machines and other methods to reduce the vote against
cut off by the break, so I'm going to cut
That's okay. The voter ID moves and all that, there are deliberate methods being used by Republican governors to try to enhance Republican prospects.
All right, we are back. Final segment of the first hour, but don't forget to tune in for hour number 2, because during hour number 2, Jim and I are going to get into 9/11, Mossad, and a few other things, because I actually have a few questions that I want to ask him.
Amazing article in the paper today, Popeye.
Which one? What's the title?
Pentagon, Bin Laden book dangerous. Officials say the account by an ex-Navy SEAL contains sensitive and classified information. Now, if anyone has never seen disinformation before, there it is, probably on the front page of your newspapers, as it's on the front page of mine.
Like
the whole thing, the whole SEAL operation was a fraud. Osama bin Laden died back on 15 December 2001, was buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with Muslim tradition. There were local obituaries about it. Even Fox News in February and March ran a notice that Osama bin Laden had died. And
yeah, there's actually I have a screenshot of the article on foxnews.com. I don't know if it's still up there, but I have a screenshot of it where it was from December of 2001, and it said Bin Laden dead with a question mark.
Yeah.
And all this information coming out that nobody had seen him in a while, in a little while. And then all this information was coming out that he was dead. And then suddenly, a couple of months later, one of his tapes comes out of, what they found a tape in a cave or some crap.
He was too useful as a boogeyman, see? So they started putting out these fake audios and fake videos and all that. I had experts on Bin Laden's voice and all that, consulting with scholars for 9/11 Truth, published press releases about the fraud and all this sort of thing at the time. But you see, it was so beneficial to Obama to be able to claim to have killed Osama that they arranged for his second death in Pakistan. I mean, look what happened, Popeye, how brilliant it was.
He spiked the football, Jim.
All this controversy over Obama's birth certificate was rising to a peak. There were complaints about him not having closed Guantanamo. There were issues about him having troops stationed in Pakistan. So they staged the phony raid using troops in Pakistan. Oh, aren't we glad they were there after all? Based on a tip allegedly originating from Guantanamo. So I guess we're relieved Guantanamo's still open after all. And makes Obama out to be the great hero when the whole thing was a fraud. They even had, this photograph showing members of the cabinet, the vice president, secretary of state, Obama himself intensely watching a big screen TV, and it was described in newspaper articles as them intensely following the action as it went down. But Leon Panetta, the head of the CIA, reported subsequently, within a day, that during the first 20 or 25 minutes, there had been no coverage at all. Well, these things only take about 5 minutes, I mean, frankly, from beginning to end. And then you had all these SEALs involved in this op on a helicopter that crashes and they're all killed. I mean, this is called a cover-up, boys and girls. I'm sorry to say. They killed these SEALs so they wouldn't talk about the fact that the raid was a stunt.
Yeah, you know how hard it is to hit a Chinook helicopter flying low, because they fly low and fast. You know how hard it is to hit one of those things with an RPG, one of the world's most inaccurate weapons ever, because the thing spirals when they fire off. I don't know if anybody's ever seen an RPG take off, but it doesn't fly in a straight line like one would have you believe. So the 1 in a million shot that this lucky Taliban guy got off from the mountains. Come on, dude. They planted a bomb on that helicopter. The helicopter itself wasn't even a SEAL helicopter.
And they originally claimed they had footage of all of this, but of course the footage has disappeared. They buried him at sea.
Well, you know what happens, right? All these cameras that the government buys, they buy them apparently from the same place. Because apparently they supply all the governments of the world, too, and all the cameras around the world. It must come from one company, and that means that this company makes really shitty cameras because you need them to work. You ever notice that?
Well, it is not an Islamic tradition to bury a body at sea. I mean, the whole thing was ridiculous. They claimed they had DNA results much too fast. When this was going down, I was publishing one article after another on my Facebook page. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was such a blatant hoax. But then, as you say, we're going to get into 9/11, which was an even more blatant hoax. I mean, it's just embarrassing. It's shocking. It's disappointing. It's stunning. There it is. But you see, it just happens, this article is in the paper today, and this just happens to be the medal of the Democratic Convention. So it just happens to remind us of how brilliant Obama has been by taking out Osama when George W. Bush, really gave up the ghost. Of course, what happened was Bush learned that Osama was dead, so there wasn't any point trying to kill him. So they realized how beneficial it was to kill him again.
Well, I mean, it's like watching a movie production in slow motion. I mean, people that can't see it, from an outsider's perspective, I see what the Democrats are doing. See, I don't buy into either of the two parties. I don't even buy into the libertarian wing. Like you and I were talking about the whole Ron Paul phenomenon. You know what? I never bought into the cult of personality with him as a human being. I bought into, or I shouldn't say I bought into, I believe in his message, what he talked about with, freedom, personal responsibility, and stuff like that. And yes, I agree with that. But cult of personality-wise, no, I don't agree with
Ron Paul,
of them.
He doesn't have a scintillating personality, but his foreign policy was a work of genius. I mean, he wants to bring all the troop home. He wants to end the wars. He wants to cut off foreign aid. I mean, those are very appropriate moves. The country has been drained of its national treasury. We're just like Rome. We have an empire we can't afford, and it's corrupting the nation. I mean, these things happen in cycles, and then the American empire is on the downhill slide. It's Tom Lehrer used to talk about sliding down the razor blade of life. Well, we're on that kind of slide as a nation, I'm sorry to say. The situation is simply abominable.
Yes, it is. And then you have, this whole thing with the RNC, the DNC, the whole election. It's a joke. There is no real election. I mean, Bev Harris has talked about this from black box voting. It's been, 2000 election with Bush, 2004, 2008 with Obama. All these elections are fixed. That's why they have to keep it within a certain. You have to keep it within a certain amount of space between.
Well, the Republicans in Pennsylvania and Ohio are already boasting that they're going to give the state to Romney. I mean, now that's not a representative of democracy speaking. He means they're going to rig it. They're going to use these voter ID laws to suppress the black and the Latino vote so that the Republican votes will count for more, but there's so few of them, they have to rig the game, and they're doing that using these electronic voting machines, which don't even have a basis for a recount. I mean, these are the ultimate black box. So Bev Harris is good. Brad Friedman, if you get a chance to read Brad's blog, is simply brilliant. I had Bob Fitrakis, who was an expert on the Ohio 2004 election, featured to discuss the recall election we had here recently in Wisconsin, and he explained to me how even that election had been rigged, which I believe because there was so much enthusiasm for getting rid of this crackpot. I mean, he is one of the real extremists. But you see, when they can control the outcome using the electronic voting machines, they don't care about whether they're popular or not. They know they're going to win anyway, so they can be as lunatic as they want. And we're getting there. We're getting there.
The guy that testified, listen to me, he testified to Congress or Senate, one of these committees about this. He told them, you have to get the source code from Diebold and the companies themselves that make the voting machines, and in the source code is where this stuff is hidden. And then Congress said, okay, Diebold refused to give them the source code, and then this guy dies in a single-engine plane crash.
You may be talking about Mitch Connell, who was, the IT guy for the Republicans. He worked for Karl Rove. He was an anti-abortion fanatic and apparently was a genius at rigging elections because of that commitment, but had a change of heart. And he was actually flying back to Ohio where he was going to be deposed by Fitrakis and another attorney when the plane crash occurred. I think it's more than coincidental that he died just at the time he was basically going to come clean.
In your book this dovetails with your book about Wellstone. You talked about how you showed a couple different examples of how these single engine plane crashes, these tiny small planes that these personal private planes that people take up, they tend, even if they're dual engine, they seem to crash a lot when it's a senator or a politician or somebody in the know.
Yeah. Well, in the 2000 election, Mel Carnahan, who was running for the Senate in Missouri, died in a single-engine plane crash under mysterious circumstances. He appears to have been taken out. It was 3 weeks before the election, and the governor then of the state said that if he were elected, that he'd appoint his wife to replace him. The people of Missouri were so unhappy with John Ashcroft that they preferred electing a dead man to the Senate to returning him to office. So the Wellstone case was a refinement. The amount of time before the election was reduced to about 10 days from 3 weeks. His wife was aboard with him, so she couldn't stand up to be in his place, when the election would occur. And then during the funeral, which because it was so close to the election was bound to have political overtones, the Republicans ran a smear job to claim that the Democrats were being disrespectful by talking about getting back on the green bus. Paul Wellstone had this green bus he campaigned in. It was an obvious, predictable thing. And then you had people like Peggy Noonan on talk shows concurrently, not having seen any of this, blasting the Democrats for being disrespectful to the memory of Paul Wellstone. The Republicans were worried that an event that could electrify the Democratic Party had to be toned down, had to be suffocated, had to be smeared. So they just went ahead and did it.
And Wellstone actually had gotten threatened. This is why you have to go read Jim's book. And it doesn't matter it doesn't matter if you believe in the left and the right. I don't believe in either. But even if you are a hardcore Republican, you should go read his book strictly because he shows how Wellstone was not only, the evidence is there that he was murdered, but he was also threatened by Cheney for his stance on the Iraq War. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hour one up. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. It is September 5th, 2012. This is the Wednesday night edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. And tonight I am joined by Professor Jim Fetzer. And in the first hour, we were going over politics, abortion, sex ed, a few other controversial topics, things that we often do not get into when Jim comes on. And that's why we kind of wanted to go over, new territory a little bit, as it were, and have some debate on the subject. And hour number 2, as promised, Jim and I are going to get into Mossad, Israel, Iran, 9/11, possible World War III in the Middle East. I want to get Jim's take on a few of these things. So let's start off with Mossad's involvement with 9/11, Jim. I know you've been working with Joshua Blakeney on this, and I actually interviewed you both last year. I had you guys on for 9/11. What new stuff have you guys come up with?
Well, and Kevin Barrett and a fellow named Greg Felt and so forth. There's this came up during the Vancouver hearings where, multiple witnesses established conclusively, in my opinion, that no Boeing 757 had hit the Pentagon. The whole thing was fraudulent, that a plane flew toward the building at one point, but it was 300 feet in the air too high to have hit a lamppost and then swerved over the building. At the same time, explosives were set off. In fact, the trucker buddy of a friend of mine was actually in front of the Pentagon at the time and told him he'd witnessed exactly that happening. But this is completely contrary to the official account, where you have this 757 barely skimming the ground at over 500 miles an hour, taking out lampposts and then hitting the building on the ground floor. This is all aerodynamically and physically impossible. I mean, if you're being told things that are inconsistent with the laws of aerodynamics, of engineering, and of physics, you have a pretty good reason to believe you're not being told the truth. there's something called ground effect that would prevent a plane at that speed from getting even closer than 60 or even 80 feet into the ground. The Pentagon isn't even 80 feet high. It's about 71 feet high. So, I mean, the whole idea of this plane at 500 miles an hour skimming the ground is aerodynamically impossible. Plus, if a plane's taking out lampposts traveling 500 miles an hour, when they're stationary, it has the same effect as if the plane were stationary and the lampposts traveling 500 miles an hour were hitting the plane. It would rip off the wing. The fuel in the wing would have blown. The plane would have cartwheeled, tail broken off, done all this damage to the lawn. None of that happened. We know the Pentagon is a done deal. It was all a fabricated case. Then we looked at the Twin Towers, too, and they compared multiple theories. One's called a pancaking truss theory, which is about as absurd as it gets. It's treating the floors of the Twin Towers as though they were records on a 45 or 78 spindle, and then they just drop and drop and drop. So at the end, you'd have a big stack of these trusses, which wasn't the case. You'd have the spindle still, or the core column still standing. You'd even have the external steel cage around it still standing. Ridiculous theory. The building's being blown to pieces from the top down and being turned into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. And when it's over, there's nothing left. So the theories that were considered, it can't be nanothermite, which doesn't have the explosive capability. Mark Hightower and I published several articles showing that was an indefensible theory. There's a law of material science that you have to have a detonation velocity equal to or greater than the speed of sound in the material. In concrete, it's 3,200 meters per second. Steel, 6,100 meters per second. But nanothermite, the highest detonation velocity is only 895. You can't get there from there. So that left the theories of mini nukes of some kind of arrangement. There are theories. There's this guy Kolosov who's advocated 150-ton kiloton nukes in the basement of each of the three towers, but that's ridiculous because it would have destroyed the buildings from the bottom up, not from the top down. Plus, it would have destroyed the bathtub or this dike within which the Twin Towers were built to keep Hudson River out from flooding beneath the lower Manhattan. But just because that theory of nukes is wrong doesn't mean other theories about the arrangement of a large number of small nuclear devices might not be right. And that indeed appears to be the consensus view, that the evidence supports the use of mini or micro nukes at the Twin Towers, where there's a little room for argument about whether there could be some special effects that had some sort of directed energy weapon. But we had a very senior research scientist, formerly with NASA, Dwayne Dietz, do a comparison of the theories which were being presented by others, and he found that the evidence overwhelmingly supported mini or micro nukes. The third, then, was the discovery that all four of the crash sites were fabricated. We could go into that in some detail, but it gets fairly complicated. Clearly, no plane crashed in Shanksville. The first reporters there explained how they had seen the eerie aspect of the crash site was there was no indication any plane had crashed there. Colonel George Nelson, U.S. Air Force, retired, told me it looked like someone had taken a bulldozer out there, dug a trench, and blown it up.
Did you ever see the video footage of the guy? I think they owned a bar or something, some sort of business, whatever it was, and they were right around the vicinity of where supposedly Flight 93 crashed, and they said that they saw a fireball in the sky, and they heard an explosion. And the video's on YouTube, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but the guy was saying that while where they were sitting, the building they were in, the lights flickered, and then they heard the explosion. And they said when he was talking to a retired Air Force guy, the guy told him that's exactly what happens when they shoot down a plane. Is the pilot right before they fire the missile, they jam the radar and they fire the missile. That radar jamming was what that flickering was. Now, I'm not saying that's accurate or not. I'm just saying that's what there is some video evidence to support that. Yeah, they did shoot 93 out of the sky.
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with those claims, Major Rick Gibney from the Happy Hooligans allegedly having done that. But the evidence is not consistent. It doesn't support it. We actually have documentary evidence, Bureau of Transportation Statistics records showing flights 11 and 77 weren't even in the air that day, Popeye. And we have FAA data showing the planes associated with flights 93 and 175 were not deregistered or formally taken out of service until 28 September 2005, which raises the questions, how could planes that weren't even in the air have crashed on 9/11 and how could planes that crashed on 9/11 have still been in the air 4 years later. This part's going to blow your mind. Pilots for 9/11 Truth have studied air-ground communications and discovered that Flight 93 was in the air, but that even after its alleged crash in Shanksville, it was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and that Flight 175 was also in the air. But long after its alleged effortless entry into the South Tower, it was over Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
I've seen the video of that. There's a shot where you see the air traffic controller screen, and I don't know if it looks like an air traffic controller screen. It's actually like, I guess, whatever, somehow the media had access to the data where you could see the planes flying around in real time, and most of them were landing, and there wasn't a lot of flights left in the air, and one of them was Flight 175, and it was cruising around. And
That's great. Yeah,
just Google it or go on YouTube and look it up. You'll see it.
Yeah, anyone who wants to follow this up can find several articles of mine on Veterans Today. One, Planes, No Planes, and Video Fakery. The more recent is my PowerPoint presentation at the Vancouver hearings. Go to the Vancouver hearings and scroll down to my presentation about fraud and fakery in the official account of 9/11, and then you'll get copies of the documents I'm talking about and the studies by pilots and all the on-site evidence that substantiates that all 4 of the crash sites were fabricated, Popeye. My opinion is this is the most powerful way to pull the rug out from under the official account of 9/11. All 4 of those crash sites were faked, fabricated, phony, but in different ways. And, of course, the most complicated cases are those in New York because they used there's still arguments about whether it's both fake video and fake planes or real video and fake planes, but it looks as though, they were using some sophisticated images of aircraft to create the impression of planes in the air, but they were performing feats that no real airplanes could do. They were flying faster than Boeing 767s could fly. They were entering the buildings in violation of Newton's laws. Believe it or not, if you do a frame-by-frame analysis, there's no slowing down. The plane enters completely its whole length into the building in the same number of frames it passes through its whole length in air, which is preposterous unless this massive 500,000-ton building provides no more resistance to the trajectory of an aircraft than air.
I'm going to cut you off, Jim, because we got a break sneaking up on us.
You got it.
But we'll pick up right here on the other side of the break. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. When I used to hear the theory of quote-unquote video fakery or whatever, or not 767s flying into the towers, at first I used to react the same way that a lot of people do. Oh, you're crazy, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And I'm not saying that I think it was holograms or anything like that, but from what my own research, especially listening to pilots for 9/11 Truth, now these guys are professional pilots, former military pilots. I mean, these guys aren't like just crop dusters. They know what they're talking about, and they've got years and years of professional experience. And they all said that traditional jet airliners couldn't have flown that low. I think personally some sort of drone. And I've had this argument with people when I say, well, they could have used remote controlled aircraft, to make and made to look like a regular airliner or whatever, and then they just went back and through the videos, whatever that was caught, they went back and they edited the images, however, to make it look like a regular passenger airplane. And people would say, the biggest argument I hear is they say, oh, come on, we didn't have the technology to fly drones. And I say, wait, hold on. So you accept that we can fly Predator drones in Pakistan from Nevada. You accept that we can remotely control a rover on another planet. But it's hard for you to accept that they could remotely control airplanes and fly them into buildings. Does that make sense to you, Jim?
Well, I think the original plan was to use remote-controlled drones. In fact, Dov Zakheim, who was the controller of the Pentagon at the time, the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld announced that the Pentagon lost $2.3 trillion from its budget. Dov Zakheim was the guy who was the chief financial officer for the Pentagon when all that money went missing. And he also had a company that specialized in remote control aircraft devices. So I think that was the original plan. The problem was they discovered they couldn't actually get the plane all the way into the building if it was a real plane. Now, what happens is in the North Tower, it's intersecting with 7 different floors. In the South Tower, 8, where each of these floors is a steel truss connected at one end to the core columns, at the other to the external steel support columns, filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. So each of these floors represents an acre of concrete. The building's 208 feet on the side. Now, just imagine what would happen if a commercial carrier ran into one of these floors in normal flight. It would be completely destroyed. I mean, we know what happens when one of these planes runs into a tiny bird that weighs a few ounces, and you get these big holes in the fuselage and all that. Look, check it out do a search on, bird strikes on aircraft. So the fact is, a real plane, even if it were a drone, and remember, that's just a control device, even if it were a drone, would have crumpled, its wings broken off, tail, body seats, luggage, if there were any, fallen to the ground. They couldn't have got it inside. In fact, loaded with fuel, it would have exploded when it crumpled up against the building. Now, what they needed, Popeye, was to get the plane all the way into the building before it exploded, because they were going to use the alleged intense fires from the jet fuel, which is actually only kerosene. As Jesse Ventura's observed, it burns lower temperature than propane for his camp stove, and yet his camp stove doesn't melt when he uses it. So it was all a fantasy, but it was good enough for a gullible American public that doesn't understand anything about melting points and all that sort of thing. So they had to get it all the way into the building, but they couldn't do it with real planes. It was impossible. Now think about this too. Not only would the real plane have exploded when it collided with the building, but the real plane couldn't have got into the building and then come to a halt if it had been able to penetrate the building. I mean, it's traveling over 500 miles an hour, as much as 560 by some estimates. And it effortlessly enters the building. Well, the plane is 160 feet long. The building's only 208 feet wide. So why does it come blasting out the other side? It only had 48 feet, Popeye, to come to a halt in a fraction of a second. Actually, it turns out to be 56 thousandths of a second. It comes to a complete halt. Well, this is preposterous. But that's what the government gave us. I mean, the whole thing was an elaborate fraud. So they had to get the plane all the way into the building before it exploded. They couldn't do it with a real plane. There are 3 alternatives. They could use it with computer-generated images or video compositing, but those would only have the plane show up after it was being broadcast. Or they could use a sophisticated hologram, which appears to be what they did. In fact, if you go online and look for a new study by Richard Hall entitled 3D Model of Flight 175, this guy did some brilliant work and took a whole bunch of the videos. There are like 52 of the videos to find which ones would allow him to plot the location and the time of the plane seen in the videos. So he worked out a plot chart of data, locations and times, based on the videos. Then he discovered NTSB had a similar series of plots and times that corresponded very closely to his, which they claimed had been based on radar data. But the claims they make about the radar data are flimsy and don't appear to be fake themselves. Then he discovered there actually is real military radar data. But when he studied it, he was astonished to discover that the plane plotted in the radar data is 1,400 feet to the right of the plane he had plotted in the videos, and appears to have been projecting the image of the plane, the hologram, which it turns out wouldn't have held together visually the right way unless they flew it abnormally fast. So that's why it's flying abnormally fast. The hologram, of course, could enter the building in violation of Newton's laws, which no real plane could do. And, of course, the hologram could be brought to an abrupt halt by just shutting off the projector so it doesn't come flying out the opposite side. Now, because they were projecting it from a real plane, which must have had, not been visible from beneath. I mean, they could have painted the underside and so forth. It was making the sound of a real plane. So witnesses were attributing the sound of the real plane to the projected images which they could see and not to the real plane which they could not. And when he studied the North Tower hit, Flight 11, he found the same radar data of a real plane, 1,400 feet to the right of the projected plane. It's really fascinating, Popeye. And then he noticed, too, that in the North Tower, when all this smoke is there, before it clears and you see the cutout, there are all these little points of light going off, which might have been a role for a thermite or nanothermite to cut the hole in the ground in the side of the building. A fellow named Christopher Holmes made a wonderful presentation in Vancouver where he showed a huge blow-up of the cutout in the South Tower and pointed out all the features that were there that should not have been there if a plane had actually entered it, and all the features that were not there that should have been there if a plane had actually entered it. I think we can shut the door on this baby, and that the evidence is simply overwhelming, and anyone who wants to review it, go to the Vancouver hearings and scroll down to my presentation entitled Fraud and Fakery in the Official Account of 9/11. You'll find my PowerPoint for this whole thing, all 4 crash sites, and how they were faked.
I think it's really interesting. Like, I've changed the way I look at a few things. Again, I don't know if they were fake holograms or whatnot, and I'm not going to pretend to stand here. I won't stand here and try to take a stance and say, well, Jim, you're friggin' crazy because there's no and the reason I say that is perhaps it was some sort of missile or remote control type thing projecting that image. And the reason I say it could be a possibility is they're just admitting now that they have these. You ever see the cloaks? They had it on History Channel like 2 years ago. The show they had called That's Impossible, and this guy was wearing a cloak, and he was working with this professor who they would project this image onto the cloak, and it would literally make you invisible if you were wearing this cloak. So who's to say that if you're being shown that technology now, we both know that the military, that means they had this technology 25 or 30 years ago. So who's to say that maybe they weren't projecting some sort of image and it was a missile of some sort or something else? We got to.
Well, here's the thing. I think the plane doing the projecting was cloaked. That would make sense.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if whatever was coming up,
the plane that was doing the projecting of the hologram was cloaked. Yeah.
Well, I'm saying if they can cloak, what else could they do? You know what I mean? If they have the technology, what else could they do? We got a break sneaking up on us. I want to get your thoughts on directed energy weapons and that theory, and a few other things when we come back. Don't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Jim, I know we're headed down the path towards Mossad's involvement with 9/11, but I wanted to just sidetrack us for just 1 second. I get asked all the time my thoughts on directed energy weapons being used to take the buildings down and stuff, and I'm constantly pointed to Dr. Judy Wood's work, and I think she does raise a lot of good questions about with the melted cars and stuff like that. I mean, there is some stuff that it's like, it needs to be explained. I haven't seen enough evidence myself to say that directed energy weapons were used, but she does show that something weird happened that day, and whatever it is, it's definitely not what the official story would have you believe. What do you think, in your estimation, do you think that directed energy or something like that was used to help bring down the buildings?
Well, there's an outside chance it may have been, but the proponents of the mini nukes, for example, believe that they can explain virtually all of the effects, including the toasted cars, for example. Anyone who wants to pursue this can find an article I recently published entitled Judy Wood and Do's, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Although a lot of people entertain the false belief that I've been attacking Judy Wood, actually it's been the other way around. She became offended when she appeared on my radio show with John Hutchison, and I asked him an innocuous question about his background and training, which apparently is non-existent, and he dismissed it by saying he'd flunked coloring and crayons and coloring books, which I thought was a bit much, so I just let it go and went on. But I mean, Ace Baker offered him $100,000 to allow Ace and me to come up to his lab to watch him perform some of his feats of levitation and so forth, because Ace had discovered that videos that John had produced had been faked. In fact, Ace was able to fake videos showing the same effect. So this has left things in a bit of a quandary. I actually, because of this, sent Judy an email saying that I thought that, she was running risks by her association with John Hutchison, and she might want to, consider distancing herself from him, which I later learned, only relatively recently, that she has been claiming was a threat, that I was threatening her to not talk about her discoveries. Well, what could be more absurd than that? I had her on my own radio show 15 different times. I published a chapter by her in the 9/11 conspiracy book. I gave her an unprecedented 3 hours to speak at the Madison conference in 2007. I invited her to Vancouver to speak again. I mean, how can I be suppressing her work or threatening not to talk when I'm giving her all the opportunities to present it? I mean, something has gone wrong with Judy's brain housing group. I don't know exactly what it is. Her work on the effects that have to be explained is simply brilliant. Her theory, which she denies she even has something to do, of course, with the use of directed free energy technology, as it states right on the cover of her book. And then you finally get to Judy the persona, and I'm just sorry to say I think Judy has completely lost her way. So if anyone wants to go there and learn more about the details of all this, there's that article. Now, the other area we covered that was so important in Vancouver was who did it and why. And there's a clear consensus, I mean very powerful, that it was a combination of the neocons in the Department of Defense and the Mossad, the Israeli Mossad. In fact, Joshua Blakeney, with whom I co-organized the conference, traces it back to a book that was published in 1987 by Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about terrorism, how the West can win. Before, terrorism was a word in everyone's vocabulary. I mean, he'd already mapped this out. The idea was to reconfigure the Middle East so that having a lot of, a small number of large, sophisticated Arab states that could counterbalance Israel's political domination of the Middle East, they'd be broken up into little statelets, typically along sectarian or religious lines, so that, in Iraq you potentially have the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds. I mean, dividing the country, and it's even worse in some of the other areas. So right after 9/11, General Wesley Clark was told that they had a master plan to take out 7 countries in the Middle East in 5 years, and these included Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and ultimately Iran. Well, there's no justification for this. What's the United States, and NATO has been used for this, which is supposed to be a collective self-defense organization that was created to withstand, a Russian assault on Europe. So what's NATO being turned into an instrument of aggression? When this rebel group in Libya, its first act was to found a central bank, I knew something was completely wrong. Muammar Gaddafi had done great things for the Libyan people. It had the highest standard of living in Africa. He was about to be awarded an humanitarian recognition by the United Nations when they took him out. It was disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. And it appears that what's going on in Syria are mercenaries that are being used to claim that this Syrian government is massacring people. So they go in and commit a massacre. These are people like Blackwater Special Forces types, slaughter a bunch of people, and then blame it on the Syrian government and say we got a cause of justification. Now Obama has made the statement that if the Syrian government uses gas, chemical warfare, that's crossing the line, we'll attack. Well, it's very easy to arrange an attack with gas warfare. The Israelis will just go in there and they'll gas the community, and then they'll claim it was the Syrian government. Obama will send the U.S. Air Force to bomb them. I mean, this is all completely disgusting. We've seen it over and over and over again. Now, the evidence about the Mossad is quite compelling, broad, deep, extensive. You can find one of the presentations actually by Joshua Blakeney on the Vancouver hearings website. You can hear him give his presentation. It's the highest quality video we have because Josh was using his own video. He's now the correspondent for Press TV in Canada. And he had a very high quality presentation, and it was an excellent presentation. Now, in addition, you can go online to Christopher Bolin as a book, and while it's a little heavy on nanothermite, if you discount that, which can't possibly have been the principal cause of the destruction of the buildings, quite a lot about Israeli complicity. If you go to articles by Alan Sabrowski, who has very impressive credentials, you'll find a great deal more. There's a website called Rediscover 9/11 that has a lot about Israeli complicity, and most importantly, there's a sprawling website entitled Israel Did 9/11, All the Proof in the World, that just goes through, one stage after another where these Zionists, and this has got more to do with Zionism than Israel per se, were, transferring the World Trade Center to Larry Silverstein for the first time in history, that there were lots of problems with the property. They were white elephants. They were loaded with asbestos. They couldn't be taken down by conventional destruction because it would release all the asbestos fibers in the air. he immediately, 6 weeks before the attack, insured it with a foreign insurance agency and had a clause in there, against the terrorist attacks because there were allegedly 2 planes. He claimed double indemnity. He got, I don't know, maybe $4.4 billion or more on a $114 million investment. He fired the security firm that had been looking after the Twin Towers since they first opened in 1970. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And Rudy Giuliani was deeply involved in this. You can go to Dick Cheney, even Michael Rupert, whom I mentioned before in his book, Crossing the Rubicon, pieced together, not on the basis of scientific research, but on the basis of the politics and the players and the actions that were taken, that Dick Cheney was in charge on 9/11. I'm quite convinced that's true. So Cheney and Rumsfeld was a major player, and so were others right down the line. Donald Feith, Richard Pearl, a host of others. Of course, Charles Krauthammer and William Crystal were in the background cheerleading this whole operation. General Richard Myers appears to have been deeply involved. If you now go to Veterans Today, there's a piece of mine entitled 9/11 I accuse Zelikow, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, and O'Brien. The last name will be unfamiliar to you, but he was the C-130 pilot circling the Pentagon who appears to have dropped the debris onto the Pentagon lawn, which was not present long after the alleged hit on the building. So it had to have come from somewhere. It would have been too awkward to have enlisted men and officers carrying pieces of debris out there, where one of the most prominent pieces of the debris has been traced back by an attorney from Columbus, Ohio, named James Hansen to Cali, Colombia, where it came from a plane crash that occurred there in 1995. It's a very clean piece of fuselage. It doesn't show any of the crumpling from a violent crash such as the Pentagon allegedly entailed. It doesn't show any singeing or signs of having been exposed to high temperatures like the fireballs shown, which I now believe are all fake. And it encompasses a piece of vine that enabled Hansen to track it back to the Cali crash. I'm just telling you, the evidence here is simply overwhelming. But the Mossad cannot have done it on its own. The attack on the Pentagon and the stand down of the American Air Force are clear signs of American complicity. This appears to have been
Jim, I'm going to cut you off because we're about to get cut off by the break. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Final segment coming up. Don't go anywhere. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Final segment of tonight's live edition. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in for the past 2 hours. I want to thank Jim for, coming on and having intelligent debate with me and not getting all, cranky if I don't agree with everything he says. See, that's why I like having him on and debating him on things. Jim doesn't get butthurt when I debate him about things. So, Jim, when we were going into the break, we were discussing how you said Mossad obviously didn't do this alone, and they obviously there had to have been help on the inside. Which, of course, have a stand down, anything like that, you would have had to have had, technically an inside job.
Right. Well, my 3 most recent articles should be of great interest to your listeners. One's entitled 9/11 in Zion: What Was Israel's Role? By Nick Kollerstrom, where I lent a hand by doing some tweaks and putting in some videos and so forth. It's an excellent piece. It went #1 on Veterans Today as the most read article, 9/11 on Zion. Then there's 9/11 Confessions of a Former CIA Asset by Susan Lindauer. Now, Susan was actually the conduit between Iraq and the United States before 9/11. Saddam was very eager not to go to war with the United States. He offered to buy 1 million automobiles a year for the next 10 years if the United States would not attack. And he said if that wasn't enough, for the next 20. I mean, imagine, Popeye, where our economy would be if we'd been selling 1 million cars a year for all these years to Iraq instead of bombing, which is, extremely expensive to us to conduct these wars of aggression. And then, so Susan Lindauer really confirms from the inside, as a former CIA asset, how much the administration was deeply involved in planning all of this. So you not only have the, external corroboration, where it comes in the 3rd article, 9/11 J'accuse, about Zelikow, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, and O'Brien. Here I give you 5 indictments for these key players on 9/11, and I lay out the evidence. I show you exactly what role they played and how we know they played it. because what we're trying to do with the Vancouver hearings is have each of the speakers who were sworn in when we gave our presentations submit evidence to support indictments against specific individuals for the roles here in order to put together a more general indictment for crimes committed on 9/11 to be submitted, for example, to the International Criminal Court. So there's a lot going on there, and you get an idea of what we're talking about, what we're trying to achieve. I'm telling you, the evidence is clear, compelling, and beyond a reasonable doubt. Check them out. Now, what's going on lately is Netanyahu has been trying to manipulate the U.S. to attack Iran. It's a very bad idea. Iran hasn't attacked any other country for 300 years. Iran has disavowed nuclear weapons. Iran has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has allowed inspectors. Israel has 200 to 600 of these little beauties. Israel has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel won't allow inspectors. So somebody is stirring up the pot, but it isn't Iran. It's our gallant ally in the Middle East, Israel, that's responsible for many of the crimes that have occurred around the world. If you trace the history of Israel, it specializes in false flag attacks. In other words, where Israel attacks its own people. I was in Argentina not long ago to serve as the keynote speaker for an international conference on 9/11 Truth and Justice. And I learned then and subsequently about 2 attacks that had taken place in 1992 on the Israeli embassy. And then they didn't kill enough people, so they did it again in 1994 on their own Jewish community center as a way to punish Argentina because it had been cooperating with Iran in the development of its nuclear energy program, even though it was for peaceful purposes. Now, what's going on is that, there's a continuation with these false flag attacks, which is why I say for Obama to have drawn a red line and said if Assad uses chemical weapons against his people, then the United States would have to retaliate. That's to invite Netanyahu to arrange for a special Israeli false flag attack where they gas some city in Syria and blame it on Assad. So,
exactly. And I've said that they're going to, when he said that, I was like, that's really suspect, because now all you have to do is wait for your guys to go do something, and then bam, oh, look, we have justification. He's gassing citizens. We have to get involved.
Popeye, you're exactly right. And Netanyahu has made no secret of his desire to manipulate the United States because of the proximity now of events to the election. So he believes that if there's an attack on Iran, the United States will be forced to support Israel, even though Israel couldn't carry it off on its own. Now, we have, fortunately, a general who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the name of Martin Dempsey, who's been defying the Israeli lobby's desire to attack Iran. On August 30th, he came out against a no-fly zone in Syria, which was a good thing for him to do. On August 31st, he came out against joining Israel in a pending attack on Iran. And also on the 31st, he came out against an enlarged joint military exercise with Israel. There's a tendency in general to use these joint exercises to go live. So I think he was very skillfully handling this. And I'm very impressed that this guy happens to be the chairman of our Joint Chiefs. I wish I could guarantee that it's going to continue to be a good situation, but Netanyahu is a very, very clever guy, and he's willing to manipulate situations to benefit Israel. Some of you may have never heard of the Samson option, but in fact, Israel has let it be known that they have nuclear weapons in the embassies of many countries around the world, and that if Israel thinks it's going to go under, it's going to take the rest of the world with it. This is my understanding, and I have had more than one source confirm that this appears to be the case. I've gone on international television to talk about it and had confirmation from my host there that, in fact, the Samson option is a familiar topic. So I just say this is how bad it is.
What do you think of the Democratic Party announcing at DNC that their new stance on things, and one of the stances is that Jerusalem is the center of Israel, or whatever?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't the Democratic. It was Romney. Romney was an idiot. He's in Israel.
No, the DNC just did it, though. They just actually announced that they were for it.
Well, that's ridiculous. That's terrible.
Which is weird, because if that's their new thing, that Jerusalem is definitely the capital and it belongs to Israel and everything else, they ought to know. That's just kind of, it's interesting that comes out right, and you're talking about what you just said with Israel wants to strike, and my personal opinion is if they're going to do it, they might do it. I mean, I don't want to say that it's going to happen because I don't like to predict things like that, but there is a possibility it could happen before the election, because they would probably feel that Obama would be forced to back them up. You know what I mean?
Well, frankly, when Romney was asked about talking about Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, I think he just believed it already was. I don't think he's sophisticated enough to know Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel, that Jerusalem is an international city, that there are all kinds of disputes because it's claimed by Christians, Muslims, and Jews as a holy site in their religions. It's one of the most complicated political situations. And Romney, I thought, just committed this horrendous gaffe by saying that Jerusalem was the capital or should be the capital of Israel, and it appeared he already believed it was. So for the Democrats to do this is incredibly stupid. I can't believe. Unless they think that they're going to lose the Jewish vote if they don't come on as strong as Romney about
that's
Jerusalem.
part of it. I think that's
Popeye. This is a blunder. This is bad news.
I think that's part of it, because you could see there's pandering.
That's all we have to do with Israel. In fact, one of the strong features of Obama is that he has been less inclined to pander to Israel than a succession of previous presidents, including George W. Bush and others. I mean, it's very bad of our history of giving Israel everything it wants, including when Dov Zakheim was the head of the Pentagon, all kinds of first-rate fighter aircraft at cut-rate prices as though they were war surplus items when they were top of the line. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You know, it's really quite disgusting. Israel, if anyone were to study the role of Israel in the 20th century, in the 21st, it's a lot of bad news. And of course, the subjugation of the Palestinian people is only the most obvious part about it. I mean, they attack, these vessels that are trying to bring relief supplies to the Gaza Strip, where they're running the world's largest concentration camp. I mean, it's very, very bad. Israel has the greatest propaganda operation in the world and is one of the real bona fide terrorist states, in my judgment, especially if you study the history of false flag attack, which is all too numerous and even includes the strafing in an attempt to sink the American spy ship, the USS Liberty, in 1967, where Lyndon Johnson, and this was an act of treason.
Yeah, check this out. I have to interrupt you. This is what they say. Jerusalem is and will remain the capital of Israel. That's their the Democratic, the DNC 2012 platform. Israel, Jerusalem.
Ludicrous. It isn't, and it shouldn't be. I mean, that's completely ridiculous.
This is in the Daily News, the New York Daily News.
That's bizarre.
They're pandering, dude. This really, I wondered if they're setting up.
Romney commits a colossal blunder, and now the Democrats go along with it. I mean, that's just incredible. I thought that they ought to have taken Romney apart for his ignorance about Middle East politics, where it's so complicated and convoluted.
People need to pay attention to the Middle East. It's going to be interesting.
Well, it could go up, and if it goes up, I think if we try to take out Syria, that Russia and China aren't going to allow it to happen.
Well, see, and they know this. It's going to create World War III, and you have to wonder who benefits from creating World War III.
Well, you and I may not have a lot of conversations after that if it comes to pass, Popeye, because I'm telling you, most of the world's going to be incinerated.
Yeah, not a good idea. Well, Jim, we are out of time. Thank you for coming on. As always, it's an interesting conversation with you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. And I will see you again on Friday. Until then, I'm out of here.